God of War Ragnarok was in many ways seen as a successful sequel to God of War 2018, and rightly so. Even I, who have some issues with the story, must admit that almost everything in its gameplay was vastly improved. But even though the current formula continues to be a hit, we as a community have to ask how this awesome series of ours can be improved. And this is where we run into some issues. Because the God of War fandom has been growing exponentially since the start of the Norse saga, we now have a lot of conflicting opinions on what Santa Monica should add or subtract from their next entry. And I am one of those people. That's why I decided to make this personal wish list on what 10 changes Santa Monica needs to make to improve the God of War series. Once again, this is just my opinion and it should not by any means be taken as the gospel. Not that Santa Monica listens to me anyway. But of course I say this because I also want you to share with me what 10 improvements you want to see from the God of War series. But with that said, here are my 10 ways I think the series can improve. First on the list is beards and helmets. As many of you guys know, I'm not the biggest fan of RPG mechanics, let alone in a God of War game. But it's clear to me that this isn't a feature that Santa Monica plans to stop anytime soon. So if you can't fight them, join them. That's why I think Santa Monica should jump all the way in and give players more customization options. First of all, I think transmog should be included on the game day one, not an update in the future. This needs to be in the game day one. I think we can all agree on that. However, I also wish they would add customization options that weren't included in God of War 2018 nor God of War Ragnarok. I'm talking about adding helmets and different types of beards. As it is right now, there are only a couple of armors that I think look good on Kratos, and I think this is because most of them look incomplete. Adding a helmet option will go a long way to make these types of armor stand out more. Of course, the art team working on these helmets would have to work around Kratos' iconic tattoo so it's not obstructed in any way. But even if they don't, the worst that can happen is something like the Legionnaire helmet, which I think looks pretty cool. Now, beard customization is something I've seen some fans ask about, and I think it can be interesting as long as you don't give stupid options that would contradict Kratos' character. Now, an idea I thought would be fun for this new feature is giving players different types of beard beads that serve as additional stats. That way you get more freedom to make your build completely different from other people. Would I like this?
No.
But I'm sure a lot of new fans will think this is awesome. And despite me not liking it, I understand why it should be included, as these games have a lot more RPG mechanics than previously. But now moving on to an idea that agrees more with my bias is the camera. I understand that the camera is one of the most praised new features of the reboot, but I think after 2 games, I'm ready for a change. I'm not asking to go back to the old days of having fixed camera angles, I know that's never gonna happen, but I'm talking about getting rid of the no-cut aspect of it. Look, I think this was a great feature that added a lot to the story of God of War 2018, as you get to see every single moment of Kratos and Atreus' relationship heal over time. It made you feel like you were right there with them. But in God of War Ragnarok, the story became a lot more complex. There were more characters as well as more location changes in the main story. In this type of story, the camera contributed a lot to the game's problematic pacing. That's not to say that Santa Monica didn't do some really cool stuff with it, but overall I think having a more dynamic camera will go a long way to help the future game's pacing. And it might even add more emotion to some scenes. But it's not just the no-cut aspect that I want to be addressed. I also wish the camera was pulled out more during combat. I'm not saying the current camera doesn't work. Even though you can see some enemies behind you, this isn't much of a problem because your companion usually distracts them while you focus on 2 or 3 enemies. But this feels more like a band-aid fix than an argument for why this camera should stay in. Again, I don't want to go back to the old camera style. I still want to be able to move the camera around so I can aim things like my axe and spear. But for the sake of a more engaging combat experience, I think they need to pull the camera back. Being able to see most enemies on the screen is something I've come to really miss about the old games. But it's not just combat, pulling the camera back will also help other items on my wish list, like the ability to jump. I understand that the new games are built with a different type of playstyle in mind. They are naturally more grounded and offer more ways to play defensively, but that iconic aggressive nature of the OG games is still present. Now imagine how much more exciting these combat encounters would be if Kratos could still jump. Not only would it give players the ability to extend their combos, but it could also add a lot more depth to another section of the gameplay: platforming. Guys, look, we gotta get serious here for a bit. I don't think it's controversial to say that these climbing sections aren't very fun. You can argue that they're good for slowing down the pace and allowing characters to talk with each other. But if we're talking about fun gameplay mechanics, this just isn't one of them. Literally all you have to do is press up. And when you have to jump over a gap, all you have to do is press a button and Kratos does it for you. It feels too automated. So I think it's time the series goes back to its roots and adds proper platforming back. And you can't tell me it won't work. Look at Phantom Blade Zero absolutely nailing this aspect of gameplay. It's possible for the God of War series too. All it has to do is pull the camera back a little bit. Okay, so I got a little bit nostalgic with these last 2 entries, so let me go for one that I think both Greek and Norse fans will agree with: the return of shield combat. This is one of the mechanics I'm not sure why it was cut. I guess it was to make way for the different types of shields, but in my humble opinion, shield combat was one of the best features of God of War 2018. This is because it complemented the main weapon of the game, as every time you threw the axe you would have to rely on your hands. This is something that God of War Ascension started, but it was perfected in God of War 2018 by giving it a fully dedicated skill tree. It was almost like a third weapon seamlessly integrated into the combat. It felt natural to use. So as long as the Leviathan axe is in the game, the shield combat is a must. Something else I think is a must is the addition of a Blade of Olympus-like weapon. If there's something Santa Monica has absolutely nailed in the new games, it's the side weapons. Both the Blades of Chaos and the Drop Me Spears have been amazing entries in the series, but these two are overshadowed by the Blade of Olympus introduced in Valhalla. And I understand that the Blade of Olympus is a rage instead of a weapon, but after playing around with it, I can definitely see it working as its own weapon. The Blade of Olympus definitely feels slower than the other ones, but it makes up for its fluid movement and impact. I would even say it feels more fun to use than the original Blade of Olympus, mainly due to the super addicting pairing mechanic. Now the reason I said a Blade of Olympus-like weapon is because it isn't clear that Kratos will have the Blade of Olympus in the sequel. I'm of the opinion that if they wanted to, they could find a way to make it canon. But if it's going to feel forced, then Santa Monica should just make a brand new blade that feels similar to use. I don't know, maybe it was just me who really liked using the Blade of Olympus and wants to see it back. Now something else I think will offer a lot of excitement to the gameplay is more traversal items. The newer God of War games are considered semi-open world games, meaning that at almost any time you can stop what you're doing and explore some new areas. But for as big as these games are, they don't do much to entice me to explore aside from a character saying that we should look around for supplies. That's why I think the next game should include more Metroidvania-like items. For example, imagine in the next game you decide to explore a new area, but you come across a big gap in the floor that prevents you from going forward. Oh no, what are you gonna do, right? Well, hours later you kill a Valkyrie and get her wings as a new item. Then you remember that a couple of hours before there was a huge gap that you couldn't pass. But now with your wings, that whole section is opened. Given how open the new games are, mechanics like these are necessary to prevent the game from feeling repetitive. Now, God of War Ragnarok already started to move in the right direction with the Drop Me Spear, as later in the game you can use it to cross other gaps you couldn't before. But it's not until you get to chapter 10 in the game that you get the spear, meaning that before this happens you'll be doing the same type of traversal for hours, and this got somewhat repetitive. For a game as big as God of War Ragnarok, there should have been more mechanics to help the gameplay pacing. This is something that the old God of War games nailed, as every time you beat a boss or finished a level, you would be given a new toy to play with. Something like these items could add a lot to the new games. Now up until now I've been talking about things that I think would benefit most of the community. And while this next entry, I'm sure all of us will get good use out of it, it's still mostly for my YouTube buddies. I think the next game needs to give players the option to pick which chapter they want to play. Much like with the RPG mechanics, I doubt very much that Santa Monica will stop making these games story-driven. And that's fine, there's a certain charm to them. But this means that some chapters will naturally consist of a lot of walking around. And it's these chapters that serve as the biggest gatekeepers for people who want to replay the more actiony parts of the game. For example, the start of God of War Ragnarok is one section that I can replay at any time, it's that good. But the moment I reach Svartalfheim, I just lose interest in the game. And it's not just for fans who want to replay the most fun parts of the game, it's also good for fans like me who sometimes like to learn more about the lore. Instead of hoping that Jacksepticeye kept talking to Lunda in this specific part of the story, I can just pick the chapter and go there myself. Look, I understand that these slow moments are important for the story, but there's no good reason why I should have to play these moments again and again. Next time, we should just be able to pick which chapters we want to replay. At least, make this a feature you unlock after finishing the game once. Now, I understand that with this list I've been harder on the Norse games, so let's talk about something that both sagas have greatly sinned on: the lack of a proper boss rush mode. One of the things that every single God of War fan can agree on is that this series has some spectacular boss fights. Both the Greek and Norse games have done an excellent job at giving us nail-biting confrontations with these larger-than-life characters. So why is it that they've never thought about giving us a boss rush mode? A boss rush mode is where you fight all of the game's bosses one after the other, sometimes with little given to replenish your health. A more recent one can be found in Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. Now, I understand that with the Greek games this would have been a little bit more difficult to do given the constant changes in the camera angles, but with the Norse games, this would work perfectly. And the best thing is, players don't need to lose any sense of immersion, because the boss rush mode could be set up as a post-game challenge like Muspelheim or Niflheim. All they need to do is create a character or an item that lets Kratos relive his memories. And knowing Kratos, I'm sure he will use this as an opportunity to train. So naturally he will ask the character or item to project his memories of fighting the most dangerous foes. Am I the only one that thinks this would be awesome? I can't be. The bosses in these games are spectacular. It's a shame that a lot of people will just beat them once. Having a boss rush mode would allow us to relive these epic moments. So, pretty please, can we get it next time? Alright, next we have something a little bit more serious. Something that I think needs to return to make this series feel more God of War. I'm not sure what the right name for these are, but I call them combat puzzle sections. These are sections in the Greek games where you're given a very obvious solution to a problem. However, the challenge comes when you have to fight enemies while also solving this problem. No, wait. These challenges could consist of babysitting a scribe while enemies come at you from every angle. It could also be freezing one of the minotaurs on top of a pressure plate to open a door. It could even be as simple as pulling an elevator down while skeletons in a spiky ceiling come for Kratos. The solution to these puzzles are simple, but they require a lot of mastery of the combat to succeed. A good example that we can compare side by side is the sacrificed Athenian soldier. This moment can be found in both a Greek and a Norse game, but they are mechanically very different. This section in the first God of War game requires you to push uphill this caged soldier while fighting legionnaire captains. This presents the player with the dilemma of when to start pushing the cage, because if you do it at the wrong time, you could risk the cage sliding all the way down, which would force you to start the process all over again. In contrast, this section in God of War Valhalla has been simplified greatly. All Kratos has to do is push the cage for a little bit, which at one point will trigger some enemies to come out, Kratos kills them and then continues to push the cage. In this section, unless you're really bad at the combat, you will never die. The game, in other words, will not push you enough. Meanwhile, getting that cage up the hill in God of War 1 is one of the most satisfying moments in the entire game. Now, I'm not exactly sure why these things weren't added to the Norse games. Maybe it had something to do with the playtesters not liking them very much. I say this because at one point in God of War 2018, you can find one of these sections. It's very early in the game where Kratos has to fight Draugrs while throwing the axe at a gear to keep the spiky ceiling up. It's a fun instance where the game forces you to think more about your environment. But as the game continued, these moments became less and less frequent. And I don't even remember there being one in God of War Ragnarok. I could be wrong though, let me know if I'm wrong. Now, you might have noticed that this whole list consists of things that I want to be added in the sequel. That's why I decided to leave the only one subtraction for the very last entry. And I know this topic has been talked to death, and Santa Monica probably already knows that they need to fix it for the next game. But we can never have another Ironwood level. I know this might sound out of place for me to say since I'm not someone who's in a position to create any of these games, but it is my humble opinion that a moment like Ironwood must never be repeated in the God of War series. I don't think anything in the series comes as close as feeling more out of place than riding a yak for an hour while the player is forced to pick up fruits in a very scripted manner, while also sitting around admiring butterflies and skipping stones. It also didn't help that Atreus had to fight the most boring enemies in the most tedious level they could have come up with. Santa Monica, I love you guys, but let's be honest, this is where you guys jumped the shark. Now guys, don't get me wrong, some parts of Ironwood are really important. For one thing, it's the place where Atreus' next adventure is set up. But it's also full of good emotional moments, like Atreus learning about the tragic prophecy that surrounds his father. Seeing Atreus and Angrboda give birth to Jormungandr was also a highlight. And that last part, even though it was really scripted, it still gets me going every time. But I think all of these things could have been presented to the player in a more fun level. I understand that story plays a much bigger part in this series now, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, God of War is still a video game. Fun needs to be a priority. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, I'm sure I've pissed you off with some of my takes. Or who knows, maybe you agreed with all of them. At the end of the day, these are just my opinion, guys. And I love to hear what yours are. So tell me in the comment section below what are 10 things that you think need to be added in the next game. But that's gonna be it for today, guys. I want to thank every single one of my members for supporting the channel monthly. I say this every time, but without your support, none of these videos would ever be possible. I would also like to thank everyone who likes and shares my videos. I know it doesn't seem like much, but trust me, it really does help. And with that said, thanks for watching. And remember, go forth in the name of Olympus.